Good morning to everybody. Welcome. And we're really eager to have our speaker begin.
All right. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce our guest speaker today. One of our colleagues in the Division of Ethnic Studies, Dr. Charles Sepulveda. He's an assistant professor in ethnic studies here at the University of Utah. He earned his PhD at the University of California, Riverside. And he is the recipient of a prestigious Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellowship. I can't remember if you're still on the second year or if it was a 1 year postdoc, Charlie, but you can tell us a little bit more about that as well. And he's working on this first book project, tentatively titled Native Alienation, the afterlife of California's spiritual possession. I've been interested in his work since I've been doing some stuff with Spanish exploration into our region, but he's going to focus on California, his experience in California. It's a pleasure to have you here, Charles. Thank you for agreeing to speak with our group. And without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ed, for inviting me, and for everyone in attendance for inviting me as well. So as Ed was saying, my work focuses on California. That's where my family is from. I have native roots to California, and also Spanish, Mexican, Indian, Black roots from Mexico that I can also trace to beyond the Americas, to Portugal and to Spain. I've been doing genealogy work since I was probably 16 years old. I was with a friend of mine. We went to the family reading room at the local Mormon temple, and were able to use their resources and did a little bit of genealogy when I was a teenager. And then over the decades since, I've paid more attention to genealogy than other times, but I've been doing research on my family for about 30 years now. And I've, since the internet and the software has increased, I've been able to find a lot more information in the last couple of years than I was ever before. It was such a challenge to trace genealogy previously, and now it's much easier. Sometimes when you get into the older records, with ancestry.com and things like that, you're just kind of guessing, right? You're utilizing and what other people have done, and sometimes it's a bit questionable. So I'll have a question mark on certain people if that's actually their parents or not. But in California, being relatively knowledgeable because of my academic research, I'm much more reliant on my historical knowledge to be able to do the work with the ancestors who are in California. So as Ed was saying, I'm working on my first book project, Native Alienation, the Afterlife of California's Spiritual Possession. And within the book project, I also do some genealogy. So I include ancestors within that historical narrative to better understand our histories. And just reading history doesn't often tell you about individuals, right? When you read historical accounts, you hear about the major players in that history, and not the individual experiences, their lived experience of that history. So I try to include some of my ancestors when I'm telling that history. And so what I'm going to present today is the preface of my book. So it doesn't do a lot of the kind of academic stuff. I'm not engaged with other scholars within the preface, but it talks about the violence of the establishment of the Mission San Gabriel in 1771, and which is located, if you're not familiar, located about 10 miles from downtown Los Angeles. And 10 years after the founding of Mission San Gabriel, settlers were brought from Mexico to found the Pueblo of Los Angeles. And there's a reenactment every year on the founding of Los Angeles, where the descendants and other folks as well participate in a walk from Mission San Gabriel to downtown Los Angeles to the Pueblo, to the center of the Pueblo. And so I've done that a couple of times with my relatives. My auntie Irene Sepulveda Hastings, who just recently passed away, was one of the founders of the Pobladores, which is the organization that is responsible for the reenactment of this walk from San Gabriel to Los Angeles. And so I learned a lot of genealogical history of our family from her and from other elders as well. So I wasn't just looking to the archival sources, but also talking to family, including my auntie Irene. So I was going to launch into the talk, and it is violent. So I want to prepare you for that there's instances of sexual violence that I'm going to be talking about. And I don't normally give kind of what's called a trigger warning, because I think that's kind of foolish in some ways, but I also want to prepare people that that's what I'm going to be talking about. So the Spanish established Mission San Gabriel on September 8th, 1771, at its first site in Whittier Narrows, California, with 2 priests and 10 soldiers. With the assistance of the local Tarahum, the Indian people, in the language of the Tongva, who were later called the Gabrielino by being missionized at Mission San Gabriel. I'll be using the term Tarahum throughout this paper. With the assistance of the local Tarahum, they constructed a church and housing using the same native plants the Tarahum use in making their kiyi, their houses. The materials used included chi'i, tule, and shahat, willow. The strangers to Tovangar, Tarahum homelands, or the earth, were initially viewed as kuyam, as guests by the Tarahum, and provided food and shelter. Franciscan priest Francisco Palau wrote in 1773 about the founding of San Gabriel. Their friendship was such that on the day when the fathers moved to the mission, the Tarahum wished to carry their cots and decorated them with many wild flowers from the fields. With the aid of so many workers, these dwellings were finished in a few days, and a good stockade was also made for defense and some corrals for the cattle and horses. The Tarahum initially welcomed the Spanish to their lands, despite their differences, and gave their labor for free to help make their guests comfortable, as all good hosts do. A month after the mission's founding, it was reinforced with more soldiers, and relations between the Tarahum and Spanish rapidly deteriorated. The Kuyam, the guests, failed to see the humanity of the Tarahum, the Indian people, viewing themselves as superior. The Chichinavroam, the Spanish people, as the Tongva called them, rapidly became violent, and a soldier raped a Tahat woman. The Tomyar, the chief or local of the local village, hurriedly assembled a group of Nanaomayar fighters to execute justice against the predator. They came upon 2 soldiers on horseback, identified the offender, and the Tomyar directed his chu'ar, his arrow, at him. The attack was so sudden that the soldier did not have time to buckle his layered leather jacket, which could save his life from an attack. Nonetheless, he deflected the chu'ar with his shield, avoiding the death the sovereign Tarahum condemned him to. The 2 soldiers, according to Junipero Serra, the founder of the mission system in California, left the mission that morning, with one going, quote, out to gather the herd of cattle, and it seems more likely to get or to rape himself a woman. After surviving the attack, quote, the soldier, along with some others, killed the principal chief of the Gentiles. With a shot from his musket, the soldier killed the Tomyar, the chief, who fell to the ground dead where he stood. The gunshot, with its booming echo across the field and the immediate death of the Tomyar, shocked the Tarahum. In the distance, more Spanish soldiers rushed to the battle, and the Tarahum fled, expecting a volley of shots to cut them down. Palau explains, quote, "When the shot was heard at the mission, the corporal hastened to the spot with the rest of the soldiers, where he found that they had just killed the Indian. They told the corporal what had happened, and he ordered them to cut off the malefactor's head and fix it upon a pole to be placed in public view for the purposes of frightening the rest." The Tomyar's head on a post, according to Junipero Serra, was a sign of triumph by the soldiers. A few days after the death of the Tomyar, additional soldiers arrived at the mission, making another attempt for justice, including now for the Tomyar, near impossible, with the soldiers' weaponry meant for war and not justice. The Spanish thought they had restored peace when they sent threatening soldiers to the Tarahum village, quote, to let the Indian know that they had no fear of them, and also to tell them to be quiet, for they had not come to make war on them unless they gave reason for it, and that they had already seen that the Spaniards had treated them well as long as they did no damage, end quote. This threat of violence was considered peace by the Spanish, and there would be no consequence to the soldier who had raped the Indian woman and killed their chief. According to Palau, after some days had passed, the Indians came to the mission to beg for the head of their chief, which, through the supplications of the fathers, had already been removed from the pole, and they gave it to them. But although they made no further attack, they did not frequent the mission until little by little fear left them. Relations moving forward would be forever troubled by this initial violence and resistance. The Spanish had the opportunity to be guests, but instead viewed themselves, their culture, and their authority as superior, while viewing the Tarahum as lacking humanity and as ideal flesh for sexual violence and spiritual possession. The resistance by the Tarahum slowed Spanish progression in Southern California. The work of the missionaries, according to Franciscan scholar Zephyrin Engelhardt, was seriously damaged, and their effort for the spiritual and temporal well-being of the natives. Mission San Buenaventura was planned to be the third mission founded by the Fernandeños in Southern California, directly after Mission San Gabriel, but it wasn't established until more than 10 years had passed in 1782 as a ninth mission because of the violence at San Gabriel and the Franciscans' difficulty in baptizing more Tarahum. The Tarahum sought justice in other ways, and their spiritual people used medicine against the founders of San Gabriel. Shortly afterwards, the two ministers of the mission of San Gabriel fell ill and were compelled to return to Baja California. In consequence, the Reverend Father President, Junipero Serra, appointed in their places the two who were waiting there. The founding of Mission San Buenaventura was delayed, but the missionaries and soldiers at Mission San Gabriel would continue to inflict violence, justified by a logic of possessing native bodies, souls, and lands. Simultaneous Tarahum resistance would be persistent, sometimes with Nanao Mayar fighters, but more often through refusal. The sexual violence at Mission San Gabriel continued after the incident above. Junipero Serra criticized Captain Pedro Fajes in his Representación of May 21st, 1773. Serra held Fajes responsible for the actions of the soldiers, which prevented the priest's work of spiritually possessing the Indians. He wrote that 6 or more soldiers would leave the mission in the morning and go to the Tarahum rancherias looking for women. He stated, quote, "The dexterity they possess in catching with a lasso a cow or a mule, and in the same manner they lassoed Indian women in order to gratify their unbridled lust. And occasionally when the Indian men sought to defend the women, the soldiers killed several with musket balls," end quote. The Tarahum boys, Serra writes, were also not safe from the lewdness of the soldiers and were raped by the men. Sarah states that one of the priests who departed Mission San Gabriel left because he was sick from the sexual violence being committed by the soldiers. So this is an image of Spanish in California lassoing a grizzly bear. And so this was something that was commonly occurring more in the Mexican era rather than the Spanish era. But they would hold these rodeos, right, and pit bears against bulls and have them fight to the death. And so they would lasso the grizzly bears and put them in the arena with the bulls. In the first year of San Gabriel, nothing, according to Sarah, was accomplished other than violence against the Tarahum. He wrote, "This mission gives me the greatest cause for anxiety. The secular arm down there was guilty of the most heinous crimes, killing the men to take their wives. These unimaginable scenes of subjection, particularly the rape of women and boys, were not viewed by either the Spanish judicial system or the priests as injuries individual Indians could experience. Indian women, due to their race, gender, and religion, were viewed by the Spanish soldiers as sexually viable. Despite centuries of experience with the evangelization of Indians and attempting to convert them in the Americas, the Franciscans apparently never developed an effective policy to prevent the wholesale sexual exploitation of the native peoples whom they were supposedly helping," explained Cuya scholar Ed Castillo. He further clarified, "The problem was inherent in an evangelization program that, in the final analysis, relied on military force to secure native acquiescence to Franciscan authority." According to Sarah's statements, he was primarily concerned about sexual violence because it was affecting the success of God's material and spiritual conquest, and not because of the harm to Indian people and communities. According to Sarah, Tarahum resisted missionization because of the gratuitous sexual violence and murders by the mission patrollers, causing converts to Christianity. He reported that between San Gabriel's founding and December 1774, so about 3 years, they had baptized 148 Indians. The mission is composed of 19 new Christian Indian families and 154 persons. Although Indians were not viewed as chattel by the mission slave regime, the fungible, accumulable bodies were counted in enumeration lists alongside the cattle possessed by the mission. They were viewed as little more than domesticable animals, serving the purpose of expanding the spiritual empire of church and state through their labor, violable flesh, and soul. My book puts into conversation the violence of conquest that demands dispossession and the social death of the enslaved, with environmental devastation and the legacy of romanticizing Indian death at the missions and its disavowal of slavery. The history I tell is more than events. It is a process of forming structures of possession, a continuum and an incomplete project that includes past, present, and future violations and examples of gratuitous terrorism to land, bodies, souls, and collective ontologies. I do not write about violence to perform a spectacle of human or ecological suffering, but to advance the analytical field of knowledge about California Indian histories and move beyond any discursive impulse of benevolent missionary conquest and its erasure. I write to better understand the afterlife of conquest and Native California's spiritual possession. Most writings of California's history lack the stories of individual California Indians. They are often nameless, faceless people from a generalized area whom violence, or often benevolence, was inflicted against. The erasure of indigenous individuality and their detribalization within history results from the colonial mission of native alienation. The archival documents that historians rely on were created by those who documented what was important to the conquest. My book includes individuals when possible, but I too rely on the colonial archive. Yet, My telling of history is also a genealogical meditation with a different purpose than traditional historians. Within the archive, I have found the baptismal records of some of my ancestors, including those from the village of Yaanga, which today is known as downtown Los Angeles. So this is a map of Tongva territory, and kind of in the center of that map, you see where Mission San Gabriel is, and you see various Tongva villages with the red dots. And the majority are located right as would be anticipated near bodies of water, near rivers, creeks, near springs, and to the south and west of Mission San Gabriel, you see a gray square where downtown Los Angeles is, and to the right of that is the village of Yaanga, which is where my ancestor Maria Dolores is from. And one of the archival sources I utilize to trace genealogy is the mission records. And there's a website that's been created that makes the records searchable. It's housed by the Huntington Library in Southern California, and you can do searches by names, by location, and the majority of records are Spanish mission documents, which document baptisms, marriages, and deaths. Those are the three primary sources within the church documents. And so this is Maria Dolores, and it says her origin is Yabit, which is another form of Yaanga, and her ethnicity is India, and her parents are Gentiles, so they're unbaptized Indians, and they're both listed as being from the Rancheria Yabit, the village of Yaanga, and so she was baptized in 1784. She was born around 1767, and I figured out when she was born based on her age from this document, and also from her the marriage documents when she was married, she was married the same time she was baptized, and it also provides the officiant, the priest that did the ceremony for baptismal, and the name of her godparents, Alejandro Rosas and Juana. So this is my fifth great grandmother, Maria Dolores. She was born around 1767 in the village of Yabit, also known as Yaanga, in downtown Los Angeles, approximately 10 miles from the current site of San Gabriel. She was born 4 years before the events I described previously, with the founding of Mission San Gabriel and the violence that ensued during that time. So she was alive during that violence. She married a settler, a poblador named Jose Carlos Rosas, listed in the 1790 census as Indio from Rosario, Sinaloa, Mexico. Rosa's father, Basilio, is listed as Coyote on the 1790 census, meaning he was mixed with an approximation of 1/4 Spanish ancestry and 3/4 Indio of unknown tribal origin. And his mother, Maria Manuela Hernandez, was mulata, approximately half Black and half Spanish. Maria Dolores and Jose Carlos Rosas married on July 4th, 1784 at Mission San Gabriel, 3 years after he settled on her people's lands. He was approximately 26 years old, and she was just 17. On the same day as their wedding, she was baptized as a Christian and given the name Maria Dolores. The available archival documents do not include a native name for her, the name that she was born with. Her parents' names are also not listed. The mission documents state that her parents were Gentiles, non-baptized Indians from Yabit. The archive also does not explain why they married, and she converted Christianity. So it raises questions of, were they in love? Did they meet and fall in love? And she converted because of that love and became Catholic, and she decided to, kind of abandon the spirituality of her ancestors and become Christian. Or was the marriage coerced? There was a lot of coercion to have marriages, and possibly the coercion was for political purposes, to make relations between the Yabit, the Indians of Yaanga, and the settlers who were living there in the same location as her village. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think I ever will, but those are important questions to understand these relations that were created both through marriage and relations between the settlers and the local indigenous communities. Jose Carlos Rosas and Maria Dolores had 9 children, including a daughter, Severiana Josefa, whose baptismal record lists her as Razon. So Razon means non-indigenous. While her sister Serafina Antonia was born on September 2nd, 1785, and she's listed as mestiza on her baptismal record. The same priest, Miguel Sanchez, recorded both baptisms and recorded different ethnicities for the 2 sisters who had the same parents. Several of their children, including one listed as Razon, are also listed as having an origin that is half Mission. So on these records, it said that she is half Mission Indian. Serafina married Jose Antonio Romero in 1801 at Mission San Juan Capistrano, another mission. It's approximately 30 miles from Mission San Gabriel, where Jose Antonio Romero, where he served as a soldier. Both were recorded as Razon in their marriage documents, and the priest viewed them as possessing whiteness, that neither were Indian, they were Razon, despite her mother being listed on the marriage document as India. Romero and his parents were listed as from the Los Angeles Pueblo, but their ethnicity is not listed, and his ethnicity as Razon does not provide evidence of his racial origins. I could not find a baptismal record for him or records of his parents other than on the marriage document. Jose Antonio Romero and Serafina Antonio Rosas had 9 children, all baptized as Razon. The racial politics of Spanish and later Mexican California is complex and messy. The genealogy can be challenging to trace, and the race of those found in the documentation is unreliable, changes over time, and tells us little about their lived racialized realities. The opposite of Razon is sin razón, without reason. Sin razón are the non-baptized, the pagan, the non-Christian of any tradition, the Indian, the Gentile, and the indigenous from anywhere. The binary of razón and sin razón, Christian and non-Christian, flattens race despite a complex racial caste system. Indians and Blacks could become razón through baptism, making their racial identities difficult to trace, since the primary documentation of people's lives in colonial California were the mission records, which also leave out the Gentiles, the non-baptized, at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. The non-baptized Indians were considered without reason, without humanity by the colonizers. The project of missionization as the driver of colonization in California functioned through the binary of Christian, non-Christian, working to alienate people from their non-Christian heritage and making people of color, including indigenous peoples, complicit in the spiritual possession of land, bodies, and souls. It was a spiritual conquest, after all, functioning through native alienation and devouring the souls of California Indians, ending the former worlds of individuals like Maria Dolores and her parents. Today, the widely used definition for American Indian and Native American is the legal definition used by the United States government, a member of the 574 federally recognized tribes. American Indians also include people who may qualify for citizenship, but for whatever reason are not enrolled. American Indian is a political, not racial identity. The widely used definition originates from an Anglo-American historical perspective and can leave out the other forms of colonialism throughout the Southwest, Spanish colonialism, Mexican colonialism, and the formations of racial identities within those worldviews. So people such as my ancestor, Maria Dolores, and her descendants may not qualify as American Indians according to this limited definition. Today's Taraham, the Tongva, tribal nations from Tovangar, our homelands, variously named today Gabrieleño, Tongva, Quiche, Shishonga, and Shoshone, are unrecognized by the U.S. government within a nation-to-nation relationship. The descendants of Maria Dolores and other Taraham are not considered American Indian through the widely used definition, despite the gratuitous terror and trauma their ancestors experienced. This is native alienation. No amount of genealogical or DNA evidence can change who is and who is not American Indian according to the Anglo-American political definition based on federal recognition. This widely used definition erases the long history of racialization, including the gratuitous terror of enslavement, genocide, and sexual violence that the Taraham and are survivors of. However, I'm afraid I must disagree with this limited definition. The descendants of the Taraham are Indian, even if unrecognized by the latest colonial nation and long history of colonialism. The story of Maria Dolores and Jose Carlos Rosas only exists for my family through the archive. The alienation has been almost complete. Some cultural knowledge and materials were passed down. My dad has a couple of beautifully woven baskets that he was given from his mother, but the stories have been erased. That's partly because of this history of colonialism, but they were also erased because of the deaths of women in our lineage. My grandmother's mother died when she was 2 years old, and so a lot of the stories are passed down through the women, and this line to Maria Dolores was on my grandmother's maternal side. Even though we have these baskets, we don't know who in the family made them. We don't even know how old they are. We can tell by looking at them that they're extremely old. They're much older than my grandmother, who was born in 1907. For all we know, Maria Dolores or Serafina could have made them. The stories of my grandmother's family on her maternal side are limited to a listing of church events and dates, and yet I feel fortunate to know their names, a little bit about their racial backgrounds, and that Maria Dolores was Yavit, that she was from the village of Yaanga. And the only reason I know this is because of the genealogical work that I've done, the decades of work to be able to put these fragments of stories together through the colonial archives to be able to fully tell this story was through the hard work that I did genealogically beginning when I was a teenager. I can only imagine the gratuitous terror of the time she and Jose Carlos lived. Sometimes the stories that exist are sickening, such as the one I begin with, but these stories need to be known. The people who lived these stories or lived during the same time also add to the significance of how we can emotionally connect to our kinship through a genealogical meditation on history and become speakers for the dead, telling their stories which are erased because of colonialism. We can never return to the worlds our ancestors inhabited. Those worlds are gone. But we can learn from the past in order to create a better future. The women and boys the predators went after with lassos could have included Maria Dolores or her relatives, even if their stories no longer exist and their descendants are not recognized as American Indians by the US government. My book is an attempt to better understand the lived experience of ancestors, such as Maria Dolores, the changing world California Indians live in, the mission system built to possess their lands, bodies, and souls, and the afterlife of conquest founded on native alienation. So the images I have here to end with are of the Gabrielino Tongva tribe of Los Angeles, California. There are several tribal nations, and a couple of pictures of our relatives, including some that are no longer with us. And I focused on with these images of living peoples, because I want us to think of not only our ancestry and those who experience violence, but the way that we've also been survivors, and we've survived and continue to tell our stories and continue to have relations and have names such as Sepulveda and Romero and Salas, and the multiple names that we carry and how we got those names, and to think of that the history that we didn't have those names before colonialism, that we only have those names because of colonialism, and that we are living peoples, and those names tell us a lot about who we are. Sepulveda isn't a very common name outside of California. If you go to New Mexico, for example, you're not going to find Sepulvedas except for more recent people who have immigrated to New Mexico. But in California, that name has a long history. The Spaniards that brought them to California became wealthy ranch owners, and that name is associated with the Sepulveda Basin in Los Angeles and Sepulveda Boulevard, and there's a lot of significance to the name Sepulveda. But I also have Native ancestry, and so I'm part of that history. I only live because of that history, and so it's not about saying that the Spanish were terrible people, but it's having a broader understanding of that history and how it also included these extreme forms of violence. But despite that extreme form of violence, the Tongva, the indigenous peoples, are still here, and we continue to live and learn our histories that were more recently, during the American period, were viewed as something to romanticize. So the missions became romanticized, and that history became a story that was told as benevolent. And throughout California and the Southwest, there's a lot of architecture, and so part of my work also talks about the architecture within California and how the mission system, the architecture of the mission system was glorified and romanticized and produced a revised history. And so part of what I do in my academic work is to move beyond that revision of history to tell a more fuller story that includes the indigenous peoples of California, including ancestors such as Maria Dolores. So I'll end there, and hopefully we can have a conversation and any questions you have for me.
Hi, this is Gloria Gonzalez. This was fascinating. I'm wondering if it's, in your description of the founding of San Gabriel Mission, it made me reflect that this might be a microcosm of really what happened all over the Americas, or at least at the time of the conquest. We're aware that I know in Mexico, at least, they talk about our mother, the Indian, our father, the rapist. And but we've never, you don't think about the details. I've never heard the stories of the Spanish men literally just going out there to rape women. So do you think that's fair to sort of look at this as a microcosm of Spanish conquest.
Yeah, I definitely think it is. It definitely is. I think by the time they got to California in 1769, that this had been going on for hundreds of years, and it was probably muted in California compared to what happened elsewhere, given that it had been going on for hundreds of years, and through the Enlightenment and various ways that for example, with Columbus, right, the Bartolome de las Casas papers, and like things had changed over the hundreds of years of conquest of the Americas, and so it was probably more muted in California than elsewhere, even though like this is extreme what I was reading, right? This is extreme for soldiers to go out with lassos and lasso women. But I think it was probably more muted by the time they got to California than elsewhere, unfortunately. So I definitely think it's a story that happened throughout the Americas.
I also think it was really interesting to hear about the racial categorizations, because I also have found ancestors in Mexico about the same time as yours, being categorized as mulatto, some of the children being baptized as mestizo or Spanish, actually. And I'm thinking, I've never thought about why, that it was just about the way they look or their skin color, or that because you have children born to the same parents, like you were saying.
Yeah, and we don't think of races as changing over time, right? We think of them as categories that are consistent, but race is an idea more than it is about biology or ancestry. It's really an idea, and so those categories change over time. And I could see within my family from two generations how quickly that could change from being categorized as Indian to being mestizo, one sister, and the other sister isn't even listed as Indian at all. She's considered razon, which is, if you're razon, that means you have all the political positionality of being Spanish, right? Even if you're not treated that way on a lived experience, the documentation shows that was her political positionality.
Well, thank you.
This is Albert. A lot of the reading I have come across, have done, pretty much states that the recording of the race or ethnicity or the caste system that they're in was done by whoever was doing the recording. They would look at that person and do a guess. So that's why you could have different siblings classified as different, because it's just based on whoever was doing the recording. The church books would list what they thought they were. So
yeah, definitely that happened a lot, and that even happened more recently in the U.S. Census.
Right.
And so to trace genealogy sometimes, and you're finding results and you're like, no, those people weren't white, or they weren't whatever they're listed as. Even people you might know, your parents or your grandparents in the most recent census, that was released in the 1950 census, and often that's even incorrect. People were listed incorrectly.
But a lot of it's due to your self-identification. I know back in the 80s when I was working for the court, I was so surprised when these two kids from the same family, one was listed Mexican, the other was listed white. So it still happens today. And now it's more of a problem because you self-identify. So I can identify as Mexican. If my sister wants to identify as white, she can do that.
Right. Yeah. A lot of it is self-identification, and then the racial politics of self-identification as well, that being listed as white, there's more security in your position as being able to not being removed from the United States if you're listed as white, or less violence against you if you're listed as white. So a lot of people within the records would list themselves as white and not Mexican or Indian or what have you.
Well, it just, what Margie's comment just made me remember when my son was born. I had a little lady with a clipboard come into the hospital room, and her first question to me was, "Are you Spanish?" And I don't claim to be Spanish. I've always said I'm Mexican American. So she put my son's race down as Mexican, and then, but whoever, when that piece of paper got to the vital records, they changed it to white. But I hadn't, it just, that was probably a lot how some of those categorizations get made, is some, little person, some volunteer who comes along and asking you those questions about the newborn child.
Yeah.
I've always been kind of confused with this black, white, red, yellow, I've always thought that I was in the white race, but I'm not Anglo. I'm in the white race, but I'm Mexican American. So
You're right.
So we have to put white because we're not black, we're not Native American, red, and we're not yellow, which would be Asian. And I hate those. I hate that, but I don't know what else. Maybe the doctor could explain that, or Ed could explain that to us, why we have these white, red, yellow, and red, because it's on all of the forms.
Well,
So,
it's
Ed, I don't know.
Hispanic. Yeah, it's Hispanic. It's not red. I usually put down other because I don't like any of the categories. And sometimes I do put, when I put Hispanic, I do put Chicano, like as you might imagine I would.
But Ed, what about when your only choice is white or black?
Right.
Yeah. And
that's what I'm saying. That's why I put other, because I don't feel that I have a white experience, quote unquote. So I use other, and it kind of depends on, like Charles was talking about, the racial politics of the day, and like other people have brought up, how people want to identify you, how people identify, and then the categories that are available as well. There's the only time that they counted Mexicans was in the 1930 census. All the other times they were, and before 1970, they were categorized as white. We were categorized as white. So that kind of messes up all kinds of statistics that were put out by the census for, historically, and that's the problem we have with even research today, when we have like white versus non-white categories in social science research, and they don't pay attention to, the experiences of brown. And then let's we can't forget that there's politics within our own group with, los negritos or, mulattoes and all that. We do have that kind of different treatment of people that are darker skinned. And a lot of social science research also shows that darker skinned, more indigenous looking Latinos, Latinas, or Hispanics, whichever term you want to use, don't do as well as white complected and more European looking Hispanics. They tend to do better. So yeah, it's a complex thing with regards to, racial categorizations, classifications, and it's something that I kind of deal with as well. It's not just with like census data. It's like any kind of official data, like criminology statistics as well. Health statistics, all these types of things. They're kind of skewed because we don't have proper categorizations. And I've noticed
I had the same experience that Dolores has, and I always thought there was a distinction between race and ethnicity. So
correct.
all those forms have both, right? They have a race, and then they have an ethnicity category.
Yes.
But when race, they don't have Mexican. There's no Mexican race.
Right.
That's why, like Dolores said. So I put white as race, but my ethnicity is definitely Mexican.
That's what I do
American.
too, Ed.
That's what I do. So,
Yeah.
and now it's getting even, because the ethnicity categories keep changing almost all the
Exactly.
time. So now when you got interracial marriages, right? We have students that come in, well, my father's African American and my mother's Caucasian. So what is my ethnicity, right?
Never seen
So I can understand how ethnicity changes, but race, it's always been that way for a long time.
Why don't they put Caucasian on those forms? I
They
always
used to
find
have that. They used to have that a long time ago, but it's they've been doing the census since 1790, and even within the census, the categorizations have changed over the years.
yeah.
Yeah. Charles, I wanted to ask you. I was kind of intrigued. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you for
Thank you.
sharing
Beautiful talk.
your talk
Thank
with
you.
us and reminding us about the violence that was committed through Spanish colonization, American colonization, Mexican colonization as well. But I find it interesting. I kind of got interested in this Spanish exploration and started looking at maps and documents. And I found it interesting, the map for the Dominguez and Escalante expedition started like on July 4th, 1776. And I noticed that your ancestor, her baptism and marriage was on July 4th as well, which was, I don't know if you ever thought about that or whatever, because I just find it interesting. But the other thing I guess I was I want to get at is, how did you become involved in at such a young age in genealogy? Was it because of these issues of identification or ethnic identity? Is that why? Because you mentioned you were 13 years old. Is that what you? And then going into the missions and searching documents, and instead of out playing, football or or whatever.
And I have another question in that same vein. You said you did it with a friend of yours who was probably about the same age. I'm wondering if the friend was our last speaker who started his genealogy at age 15 too. Remember?
Yeah.
Who was your friend?
Yeah, no, my friend, I don't even know what happened to him. He's not,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I was always interested in genealogy, partly because my family on my dad's side is, so ingrained in California. Like one of our family names is Yorba, and so our family, my grandfather was born in Yorba Linda, and so we go to these family functions, and it felt like we were related to everybody, right? But I didn't understand, how are we related to them, and I'm still kind of piecing that together, like how are we related to this certain family, and oftentimes it's through marriage and these sort of things, which is even harder to trace through genealogy because it becomes so expansive, right? But I think that was part of the impetus in understanding. And then my grandmother's family, which is what I talked about with Maria Dolores, we didn't know much about her family because her mother died when she was 2 years old. And so there was a kind of history of that on that side of the family. So we didn't know much about her maternal side, and her father and her mother were both named Chavez. So that also got confusing because both of them had the last name of Chavez. And the story of her mother was that she was from New Mexico. And so trying to trace her family, and I spent a lot of years trying to figure out her being from New Mexico. And I thought the Tonga side, the Indian side, was from her father, but it was from her mother. So I was tracing the wrong genealogy through the wrong Chavezes to the wrong place. And so it took a long time to figure that out.
Oh, my.
And her family was from New Mexico, but it was several generations before her her mother. So that's kind of where it started, was just trying to figure out who our family was and how we're related to one another, and so it began there, and just evolved over time, and my academic training and thinking was aligned with the genealogy as well, where I'm studying the same people who are in my genealogy oftentimes, or they're lived during the same time that my research is happening. So within the book project, I made an effort to really include some of my ancestors to tell this story, to, you know, not make it about just history, but make it about people as much as possible. And so I do this a couple of times within the book, whether they're directly related to me or not. Some of them aren't, but I try to talk about people and their lives within that history. Ed, did you have a question that I'm?
Yeah, Ed, Charles, I really appreciate you to talk too, though. But have you done any DNA analysis? Have you found any interesting relatives through DNA?
My dad did DNA. I haven't done it myself, but I have his login and stuff for the 23andMe, and we found some family that we didn't know, and the majority of the people that we're connected to are people from like fourth generation or fifth generation away from him, and so a lot of that is finding people within Sonora and places where some of the Spanish or Mexican ancestors came to California. So it's finding a lot of folks down there that, you know, because of time and space, that we don't have any connection to, even though there's DNA connection to them.
Thank you.
I have one more question for you, Charles. Another kind of personal thing. Do you, through your research, were you able to find, like, I don't think I heard you mention your indigenous names, or do you know any of that? Or because okay, so that's how well the erasure happened then, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So if you look at these records, like I showed, the baptismal records and the marriage records and death records, especially the baptismal records, the priests would sometimes record the Spanish, the Indian names for them, and then provide a first name, or a first name and a middle name, but no last name, and they were baptized with those names, right? But with my ancestors, I haven't found the Indian names. It just has the baptismal names, and so that erasure is
complete.
Is complete.
Right.
There's no way of recovering that.
Okay.
This is Albert. I had a question as far as the tribe itself. You said it is not recognized by the federal government. So with it, on one of your slides, you showed it looked like a logo for the tribe. So is that sort of a unofficial logo, the unofficial federally recognized tribe then, that people are still working together to try to stay as a community?
Yeah, so there are several tribal nations, including that seal, and these are based on families, and so the families form tribal nations because that's what's recognized by the U.S. government is a tribal nation, not by a band or a village, or, you know, the way that we would have historically organized ourselves, but as a tribal nation that would be more representational of several villages coming together to form a tribal nation. And without federal recognition, then we are not considered American Indian. It doesn't, and the genealogy doesn't tell the federal government anything, or DNA. We can, have people that are, their DNA will show that they're half Indian or something, and that doesn't provide any proof to the federal government. So on official forms and stuff, we're not supposed to put that we are American Indian, even though we are Indian. The DNA shows it, the genealogy shows it, but for the federal government, we are not American Indian because it's a political rather than racial identity. And so as a political identity, it's a nation to nation relationship between a tribal nation and the nation of the United States. Although we don't have federal recognition, we are recognized by the state of California. The state of California has only recognized a few tribal nations, and both of the tribes that I'm connected to, the San Gabriel Mission Indians and the San Juan Capistrano Mission Indians, known as Tongva and Ahashamum, both of them are recognized by the state of California, which means that we have the ability to utilize what's called the Native American Heritage Commission within the state of California, that if there's construction on a known archaeological site where there could be burials or there could be ancestral remains of any kind, that they have to consult with our tribal nations, and we'll have most likely descendants and folks that are paid by the tribe and by the state of California to be out there on site during construction in case anything is found. And we've had thousands of ancestors unearthed through construction projects in Los Angeles. You can expect that these are cemeteries that are sometimes thousands of years old on these lands, and they're not marked or anything. So in construction projects, they're unearthing our ancestors, and so there's a mechanism within the state of California that allows the tribe to be able to rematriate those ancestral remains and do reburials. So I've been part of reburials and things like that. And it's only possible because we have state recognition. Otherwise, if we didn't have that state recognition, then they would be looking to tribes that have federal recognition to be the recipients of those ancestral remains. And so who is and who is not Indian is a big question, because of a lot of people claiming to be Indian who are not Indian. A lot of white people particularly claim to be Indian who are not Indian. They don't have genealogical connections to the first peoples of the Americas. They're not enrolled in a tribal nation. They don't have any relatives that are enrolled in a tribal nation. And so because of that, there's a large pushback within the Native community, calling people out for being pretend Indian, as it's called. And but those same claims are being utilized against people who are from unrecognized tribes, such as my people, because we don't have that nation-to-nation relationship. So we don't have that political identity as being Indian according to the federal government. So they can make claims against us as being pretend Indian because we aren't a federally recognized tribe, even though we have DNA and the genealogy and all of that. So having that documentation is also really important, because then when people make these claims against you, you can at least have something to prove to your employer or whoever that might jeopardize your job, because people are making these claims because you're not from a federally recognized tribe. And so it's really messy and really damaging and dangerous, the way that American Indian is a political identity rather than a racial identity within the kind of Anglo-American way of identifying who is who. So somebody from Mexico or Guatemala or El Salvador, who could be 100% Indian, they could be Mayan from Guatemala and not speak Spanish or English or anything. They only speak their Mayan language, and they come to the United States. They're not Indian according to the federal government. And that's those politics are really, really interesting and really about erasing Indian identities as well.
Dr. Charles, do you have like a tribal number or like a census number that you can carry around to show that you are at least Native?
So some of our tribe have what's called a CDIB, which is a certificate degree of Indian blood, and my family doesn't have that, partly because of the history that I'm telling you of my grandmother's mother dying when she was 2 years old, and her mother dying when she was 3 or 4, and so because of that history, we don't necessarily have that documentation. Could I go back and have my genealogy certified, have a certified genealogist certify that this is true, and have the birth certificates and all the records and everything lined up, and get a certificate of degree of Indian blood? Maybe. I'm not really that concerned about having that documentation. I know who I am. My tribe knows who I am. They, if there were any allegations against me, my tribal community would have my back about that. But there are people within the tribe who have that documentation, that they have a certificate of degree of Indian blood. And the only people that have certificates like that are not even people, but are Indians and dogs and horses, right? That they have a certificate of degree of blood, that this horse has a degree of blood, that it's a particular type of horse from this line, and dogs have that as well, but Indians and dogs and horses.
I have one question, I think, and then I guess we probably better move on. I'm assuming you share all this with your family, and I'm wondering if there's like kind of a variation in how it's received and whatnot.
Yeah. A lot of the older folks, including my auntie who just passed away, like their identity, even though they're mixed, and whether they have California Indian blood or not, my wider relatives, they have Indian ancestry from Mexico, or they have Black ancestry from Mexico, and you can trace that back through the system of slavery back to Africa, obviously, right? But their identity, because of the romanticization of the missions and stuff, is that they are Spanish.
Right. Okay.
They're Spanish, and they can look at the genealogy and agree on what the documents say, but their identity is Spanish, and that's how they identify, and that's what they're proud of. And so it's not that they would disagree with what I'm writing, but a little bit of, they don't understand the purpose.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's partly because of a self-defense kind of mechanism too, to kind of protect themselves from the what it means to be Indian by non-Indians or whatever? Is that kind of protect from racism and further discrimination?
Protect against racism, discrimination, and the history of land claims in California, beginning in the 1860s to about the 1880s. They didn't want to be anything but Spanish, because Spanish was closer to white. And in order to preserve lands that had been granted to these families, they needed to have some sort of purity, that they're not Indian, they're not Black, they're not Mexican, they're Spanish, because that was seen as a survival mechanism. So it dates back to those times as well, to preserve the land that was granted to the families.
One quick question, Carlos. When is your book going to be released, and when can we buy it, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm in conversations with publishers currently, so it'll probably be a couple of years, depending on how long it takes with the publishers and getting reviews back, and everything's taking longer because of with everything, the pandemic, right? Even though sometimes that feels like an excuse, but things are taking longer to get things back.
And your talk today is going to be the preface of your book, correct?
It's going to be the preface. Yeah.
Very good.
Well, I just wanted to add, just as you were saying, the complexity of the politics. I know, I don't know today, but in Mexico a few years ago, I heard in an academic setting, I heard that once an Indian or, let's say a group begins to speak Spanish, the Mexican government no longer sees them as Indian. And they're now Mexican. They're now part of the larger category. So it's just it's very complicated when it comes to any government, I think, of where you have indigenous people.
Yeah, that there are very few tribes within Mexico that are recognized by the Mexican state. The Yaqui are one of the few, and they always have a contentious relationship with the Mexican government, right?
Yeah. My father grew up in Chihuahua in the early 19th century, and he told me when he was a boy, he would see the federal troops or the army going out to fight the Yaqui. They were still doing this before the revolution.
Yeah, it's recent history, right? Definitely. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Sepulveda, we really enjoyed your talk. It was fascinating, and we'd love to have you join us. But we do have to move on with our meeting. We'd love for you to stay if you'd like. So I want to, first of all, I want to
Thank you, Charles.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, and I would love to stay. I would love to be invited back for a meeting and get to know all of you. I have a sick child at home, so I should probably leave for today.
So sorry.
But yeah.
Okay. All right.
Thank you again.
See you soon.
Take care.